So obviously, we're not saying that we are literally after the virus. We know that COVID-19 is still with us and that there's a chance that it will be with us for a very long time to come. So after the virus is rhetorical. So what we're saying is there's a time before the virus, before 2020, and then we lived through a pandemic and we saw what happened. And so we've come to the point where we need to reflect and we need to say, after that experience, after the virus, where are we now?
Well, if you remember, there was something called austerity. This was a deliberate policy choice taken in 2010 and persistently applied for the next 10 years. If you had wanted to try to make our population vulnerable to something like a pandemic, you just about couldn't have done better than the austerity policies. For example, 30,000 beds were cut in the NHS in that period. That is about 1 in 5. It's a big cut. Private care homes were privatised, and when the 30,000 beds were needed, at very short notice, in a panic, the government discharged elderly people from hospitals into care homes to make room for the pandemic workload. And of course, that caused mayhem and very serious numbers of deaths of the elderly. The other thing was that we had historically a very strong notification and isolation system dating back over 100 years. And because of the cuts to both public health and local government, that was not used by the central government when the pandemic struck. Instead, they dreamed up the infamous test and trace scheme under Dido Harding, which everybody agrees was a complete failure during 2020, one of the worst failures. And there was inadequate stockpiling of PPE, so our brave health and social care workers and many others had to carry on with very poor or even out-of-date PPE, putting their lives in danger, and some of them paid the ultimate price. And all of these things were consequences of that policy choice taken back in 2010 and adhered to despite the evidence that it really wasn't working. The economy was not booming in the 2010s, quite the opposite. And it caused a lot of unnecessary deaths. And those deaths, of course, were concentrated amongst workers who, another problem of this austerity policy, workers were not really funded very well for, if they had to take time off work. There was a furlough scheme, but for workers, low-paid workers, casualised workers, they had real problems if they felt ill. Many of them just had to carry on going to work because there was no government assistance to make good their incomes. And of course, these kinds of problems were concentrated in the poorest communities and amongst our minority populations, who often lived in crowded circumstances, having to go out to work, coming back into crowded homes. So for all kinds of reasons, ultimately traceable to the austerity set of policies, which were a choice. We didn't have to have austerity. That's why we were so vulnerable. Well, what our review of the last 400 years of British history shows is that welfare is not a luxury. It's not something as a society you only afford when you become rich and wealthy in the 20th century. History shows that actually universal welfare preceded modern economic growth, and there are good reasons to suppose that it facilitated economic growth. In other words, it's an important reason why it's very well known that England had the first industrial revolution. What's not as well known is that 200 years before the Industrial Revolution, it had the first welfare state. And we are arguing there is a causal link between those two. We're not saying that the welfare state is the entire reason why Britain industrialised. Of course, there are many other factors, but we are saying that it was an important facilitating cause, and you don't find a system like that anywhere else in the world at that time. So what it enables to do, what it facilitates in particular is labour mobility, because if you have social security all across the country, it means that young people can leave home, can move to where the jobs are, which was often towns and of course big cities like London. First of all, without fearing that they're leaving their parents behind to penury, because they're not, because the parish will look after your parents. And secondly, if you do make that move and take that risk and things go wrong for you, you're not somehow going to be left to starve. You will be picked up by this system. You may well actually find yourself back home again, being supported because of the way in which the poor law worked. But you won't have taken a sort of, a complete risk with your life. You will have gone and tried your luck, and maybe you'll have another go and be luckier the next time. England was the first country in Europe and the first country in the world where all of its population were free from famine. There was no famine in England after the 1620s. That's 150 years or more earlier than any other country or population in Europe achieved that kind of security, a really fundamental security. And what we know, what demographic historians have shown, is that England has by far the highest rate of urbanization in the world between 1600 and 1800. In other words, its population is moving out of the countryside into towns and cities much faster than anywhere else in the world at that time, and much faster than Europe. And economic growth at that time was heavily driven by urbanization. This is before the steam engine, before the use of carbon energy. So economic growth came mainly from what Adam Smith called the division of labour. People specialising, and specialisation happened in towns and cities, and then you traded the products. So this is a very important reason why England experiences this enormous growth-inducing, economic growth-inducing urbanisation. And then again, if we look at the period after 1945, when once again we re-find ourselves and recreate a new welfare state, the first 3 decades after World War II, people don't often realise this, saw the highest economic productivity growth in the country's history, higher than even during the Industrial Revolution, higher than since 1979 and Thatcherism and the free markets, the highest rates of productivity growth and full employment at the same time were 1950 to 1973 in this country's history. And that's when the welfare state was a new creation, giving the working classes new opportunities that they'd never had before.
So in the final chapters of our book, we are proposing 7 pillars of what we call an empowering society. That's a society that enables everyone to reach their potential and have the opportunities that they need to do that. And we're contrasting that with the disempowering society, the society of the post-austerity years of rising educational inequalities, rising health inequalities, and rising child poverty, which, of course, has been accentuated by some of the things that happened during the pandemic. And so that makes this a far more urgent task. And in order to do that, the first of our pillars is that we need to have a nurturing state. And that is the state that provides those resources, provides resources for education, for health, for digital inclusion, which has been another big issue before the pandemic and certainly during the pandemic. and for investment in all of the population. So it isn't just the very wealthy who have their own resources, who are able to provide those resources for their children to thrive. It's the idea that everybody in society has the resources that they need to thrive. And obviously to do that, we come on to another of our pillars, which is that of fair taxation. And what we're saying here is not that we think that ordinary people need to have higher taxation or should be experiencing pay freezes, and that there's some notion that the population has to pay for the pandemic. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that even before the pandemic, it was obvious that we needed to put more resources into elderly care, social care, into addressing climate change, and into addressing these big deficits in health and education. And what we're saying is that if you look at the data, and we present this in our book, over the last few decades, we have built up a wealth mountain in this country, so that we've gone from a situation where the total amount of wealth was 3 times the size of our national income. We've gone over a few short decades to the situation in which it has grown to 7 times the national income, and that's at a time when the national income itself was rising. And during that time, we failed to find ways of tapping into that wealth mountain through reform of our taxation system. We're not accessing that. And at the moment, it's quite clear that we tax income more highly than we tax wealth. We have a highly regressive council tax, which is a property tax system. And there is some really good research about what you could do about that and how you could tap into that wealth mountain in order to move to this new regime of fair taxation. And then moving on from that, another of our key pillars is that we need a new morality in business, and we call this ethical capitalism. And indeed, that was one of the strands of our IPPR essay. And what we're saying is we need to change the laws governing the purpose of corporations and what they're established to do, and we need to change the incentives that business leaders have, so that we move from this very extractive short-termism, feeding the demands of shareholders, offshoring profits, to instead of extracting value, to actually creating value for the economy, where business leaders actually look at the long-term health and interests of the businesses that they're running, and that they see a morality in contributing to the community that they're drawing their profits from, and in supporting the well-being of the workers that they're also drawing their profits from. Then finally, in thinking about these 7 pillars of an empowering society, we focus on the need for all citizens to have a fair voice, for their voice to be heard, and for local communities and local government to really be empowered with the resources that they need, and the voice in central government policy that they need. At the moment, we have an increasingly crony political system. We're seeing situations in which donors can have meetings with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor behind closed doors to talk about policy. What we want to see is ordinary people, through things like citizens' assemblies and empowered local communities, becoming much more involved in government. And we're also proposing an extension of the franchise down to ages 15, 16 and 17, the young people who've been on the streets campaigning for climate change and for their future, and we think they should be empowered with a political voice too.